When studying ancient civilizations, you will inevitably encounter culture shock. Even after years of research, there will always be something to make you think. Few ancient societies have been able to have such a significant impact on modernity as ancient Rome. Traces of its culture, religion, and legislation can still be seen in modern society. But that doesn't mean that everything the Romans did was logical and understandable. Here are 10 facts about the people of ancient Rome. Wearing purple was forbidden. It is now widely believed that the Romans, like many other societies, were obsessed with the idea of social division. However, many people do not realize how deep this obsession was. For example, most free citizens of Rome were not allowed to wear the color purple. In Roman society, this color was a symbol of glory, power, and imperial authority. Therefore, only the emperor and other Romans of the highest status could wear purple togas. But why did the color purple have such status? It is because making purple dye was incredibly expensive. All purple dye was produced in Phoenicia. In order to create enough dye for one toga, 10,000 clams had to be ground up. This meant that the value of purple dye was equal to the value of gold. The Romans liked to determine a person's social status simply by looking at their clothes. Emperors allowed senators and the wealthiest citizens of Rome to wear togas with only a purple stripe, but no more. In the Roman system of social division, everyone had to stay in their place, and only members of the upper classes could publicly display their wealth. Prostitutes were required to dye their hair blonde. This rule again indicates a connection to the Roman obsession with class and social status. Most Roman women had dark hair by descent. The light-haired were associated with the Gauls and barbarians. In ancient Rome, prostitution was completely legal, and men who used such services did not face any social repercussions. At the same time, prostitutes, especially those from the lower class, were usually looked upon with contempt. In order to ensure that there was no confusion and that no one mistook an honest Roman woman for a prostitute, a law was established that required prostitutes, many of whom were slaves and therefore had no choice, to dye their hair a light shade. This was intended to give them the image of barbaric Gauls rather than noble Roman ladies. This law was in effect for some time. However, unfortunately for the lawmakers, aristocratic Roman women soon became jealous of the attractive image of blondes. They began to either color their own hair or demand that poor prostitutes shave their heads so that blonde wigs could be made from their hair. Fathers could sell their sons into slavery. Slavery was known to be common among the Romans. Their majestic empire was built on the labor of defeated opponents. In Rome, slaves had no rights and led a meager existence. For the most part, Roman citizens were protected from the threat of slavery as long as they did not transgress the law. However, there was one unusual exception. Roman fathers could sell, or more correctly, hire out, their sons into slavery, but only on a temporary basis. The father and the possible buyer had to agree on the cost and term of the son's slavery. At the end of that term, the buyer was obliged to return the son in roughly the same condition in which he received him. Like many people in Roman society, a father could only sell his son into slavery within reasonable limits. He could sell the same son twice, and this was considered normal. However, if he sold his son a third time, he was considered an unworthy father. Any son whom a father sold 3 times was legally free from his greedy parents, but only after his third slavery was over. Nevertheless, the rule of 3 sales applied to every child. This implied that if a father wished to continue to receive income from his children, all he had to do was continue to apply the rule. Originally, fathers were legally allowed to kill their families. Ancient Rome was always characterized by patriarchy, but in the early periods, the Romans exhibited this trait to an extreme degree. In those days, all members of a family were, in fact, the property of its head, the father. He could do with them as he pleased, which explains the possibility of selling his sons into slavery. The father chose his own way of punishing his children. If he thought his children deserved the death penalty, he had the right to kill them without any legal consequences. Even after leaving their parents' home, the children were not safe. Even after marrying and leaving home, A daughter could be killed by her father. Sons were not safe either. They became fully independent only after being sold 3 times, which of course was far from ideal, or after the death of their father. Subsequently, these rules were relaxed. By the 1st century BCE, the right of a father to kill his family was largely abolished. However, if a son was convicted of a crime that defamed his family name, the father was still allowed to kill him. Capital punishment in Rome, dying at the hands of one's own father, was not the worst option. The Romans had many sophisticated methods of punishing criminals and prisoners. They could execute them by beheading, throwing them from a height, or forcing them to participate in gladiatorial fights and performances. The most gruesome type of execution was reserved for those who committed the most serious crime, patricide. Anyone accused of killing his father was first blindfolded, as it was believed that he no longer deserved to see the light of day. He would then be led out of the city towards the nearest large body of water. Once there, they would be severely beaten with sticks until they were half dead. He would then be tied up and placed in a large leather sack along with a snake, a dog, a monkey, and a rooster. This set was then thrown into the water, where they either drowned or were killed by the attacks of the hysterical animals. They had confusing rules regarding adultery. It is not hard to see why the ancient Romans had different rules and regulations depending on whether the perpetrator of adultery was a man or a woman. It is quite expected that men had more freedom in their actions. They could have mistresses, visit prostitutes, and society did not condemn them for it. Problems arose only if society believed that a man was abusing his position. The situation for women was quite different. If a husband found his wife in the arms of another man, he had to lock them in a room. From that point on, he had 20 hours to gather as many witnesses to the incident as possible. Once the witnesses were found, the husband had another 3 days to gather evidence. He needed to establish the duration of the affair, the location of the affair, find out who the lover was, and gather any other information that could be related to the case. Once all the facts were gathered and organized, the husband had to divorce his wife. The Romans did not forgive adultery, and if the husband could not divorce his wife, he could be accused of inciting his spouse to commit adultery. If a husband wanted revenge, he could kill his wife's lover if he was a slave. Such people had no rights in Roman society. If the lover was a citizen, the situation became more complicated. In such a case, the husband had to go to his father-in-law and involve him in the case. In Rome, fathers had the right to kill their daughters' lovers. If the father agreed to this, the lover could be killed, regardless of his social status. There was also the possibility that a father could decide to kill his daughter as well, thus saving the husband from having to divorce her. They believed that Christianity was a cannibal blood cult. Although Roman expansion was not as extensive as some other conquerors, the Romans were still not overly cruel. For example, they usually respected the religious beliefs of the natives. At their best, the Romans appropriated the religious practices of other peoples, which explains the similarities between the Roman and Greek pantheons. So why did the Romans have so much trouble dealing with Jews and early Christians for so long? The reason in part lies in the fact that the customs of Jews and Christians were disliked by the Romans. The Romans clearly disapproved of the Jewish rite of circumcision, considering it a cruel mutilation of the genitals. The Romans committed many cruel acts in honor of their gods, but even to them this small piece of skin at the tip of the penis did not seem unnecessary. Christians, on the other hand, were initially perceived as bloodthirsty, cannibalistic cultists. The Romans did not understand the metaphorical meaning and took too literally the words about the body of Christ and blood of Christ, which are the basis of communion. The body parts of gladiators were used in medicine. A badly corroded Roman bronze shearer kept in the Science Museum in London. The strigil was a Roman tool used to scrape away fat, skin, dirt, and sweat. Gladiators sold containers of scrapings of their sweaty skin. In a surprising irony, Roman attention to detail did not extend to the remains of gladiators. Roman medics claimed that consuming the body parts of fighters as food could help cure a variety of diseases. Apparently, their blood and liver were particularly effective in treating epilepsy. When gladiatorial contests were banned, The Romans began replacing them with the blood of executed criminals. If that seems repulsive enough, this obsession with using gladiator body parts permeated even Roman cosmetic rituals and bedrooms. Dead gladiator skin cells collected during bathing were used in cosmetic face creams and as aphrodisiacs. Urine was a valuable commodity. Active use of public toilets was common among the inhabitants of ancient Rome. These places not only served to fulfill natural needs, but also functioned as important social hubs. Of course, such places were overflowing with waste, and the Romans had to be inventive to handle their disposal. The Romans were known for their engineering talents. In Rome, most sewage was directed to the Great Cloaca, one of the world's first sewage systems. From there, urine was collected and sold as a chemical for laundry and leather treatment, due to its ammonia content. Roman dry cleaners specifically visited the toilets to collect urine. Urine collection became such a large-scale endeavor that Emperor Vespasian imposed a tax on it. When his son Titus expressed his outrage at this unpleasant way of making money, Vespasian offered him a gold coin to smell. He then asked him if it smelled, and when Titus replied in the negative, the emperor remarked, "But it came from urine." Roman public restrooms were disturbing. Romans are generally perceived as having a high regard for cleanliness, and in many ways this is true. However, this does not mean that Roman public toilets would have met modern standards of hygiene. There were over 140 public restrooms in Rome. These were not private rooms, but places where people could socialize while attending to their natural needs. As noted earlier, most of these public toilets were connected to an impressive sewage system that many later societies could not match for centuries. But this is where the positives end. Archaeologists have uncovered a wealth of evidence that these public toilets were the source of a biological threat that was only a matter of time. Research shows that these restrooms were almost never cleaned. Archaeological evidence suggests that they were full of vermin. If that's not enough, consider that these toilets were created long before toilet paper was invented. Every public toilet had just one sponge on a stick, called a tertiarium. It was used for cleaning after defecating, and it was never cleaned either, of course. But that's not all. Animals like rats and snakes lived in the sewer system. There are records of people who spent too much time in the toilet and were bitten in the most undesirable places. The toilets also produced large amounts of methane gas. It had the unpleasant characteristic of accumulating under the toilets until it ignited, becoming a potential bomb. The situation was so bad that spells meant to exorcise demons were found engraved on the walls of public restrooms. People even brought statues of Fortuna, the Roman goddess of luck, with them when they needed to use the restroom. Facts about the Romans. We have borrowed a lot from the ancient Romans into our modern society. They were amazingly advanced for their era. However, historians have long idealized the Roman era, neglecting its shortcomings. Analyzing their legislation and regulations, one can see that the Romans were remarkably cruel. The rights of citizens were restricted unless you belonged to a certain social stratum, and slaves lived in appalling conditions. A Roman caught in modern times would probably be shocked at some of our customs. Likewise, a traveler from the future would probably be surprised by what he or she would see. So it is always important to learn from history without being too critical.